He didn't look around. That's the detail that stays with me. A stranger approaching a house in the dark at 2 in the morning in a mask, carrying a gun, and he doesn't scan the street. He doesn't hesitate at the driveway. He doesn't look left or right to check if anyone is watching. He walks directly to the camera, not the door, the camera first, like he already knew exactly where it was. And that one behavior, that single, quiet detail, is what the FBI says changes everything about this case. Stay with me on this one, because if you've been following the Nancy Guthrie case, what I'm about to walk you through is going to reframe a lot of what you thought you understood. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this case is still moving, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. Now, most of the coverage on this case has stayed focused on February 1st, the night, the footage, the masked figure at the door with the backpack and the holstered gun and the flashlight gripped between his teeth. And that footage matters. It's the clearest visual evidence we have of what happened. But here's the problem. February 1st isn't where this story starts. The FBI has quietly made clear that their focus has shifted, not away from that night, but backward from it. 3 weeks backward, to a date that keeps surfacing in this investigation no matter how many other leads get followed and closed. January 11th. I'm going to come back to that date in detail, because what the FBI found connected to it is the most significant development in this case since the footage was released. But before we get there, we need to establish something first. Because the question at the center of all of this isn't just who took Nancy Guthrie, it's how. How does someone build an operational profile on a private 84-year-old woman living quietly in a residential neighborhood in Tucson? How do they learn which house is hers, what her schedule looks like, where her cameras are positioned, what her security setup looks like from the outside? You don't get that from a public record. You get it through observation. And that word, observation, is what pulls this entire investigation in a direction that I don't think has gotten enough attention. So let's talk about the street itself. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood is not the kind of place where strangers go unnoticed. It's high-income, tight-knit, the kind of community where people notice an unfamiliar car parked too long on the wrong block. If you don't belong there, you feel it. Neighbors pay attention. But here's what's strange. During the weeks leading up to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, there was an entire category of human presence on those streets that generated zero suspicion. None. Not from the neighbors, not from the cameras, not from anyone. Construction workers. When reporter Brian Anton drove through the Catalina Foothills while covering this story, he saw it himself. Multiple active construction sites throughout the neighborhood, multiple homes under construction simultaneously, multiple crews, multiple rosters of men with hard hats and work boots and clipboards and tools moving through that neighborhood every single day. Men who had a completely legitimate reason to be standing on any street at 6 in the morning, at noon, at dusk. Men nobody questioned, men nobody looked twice. And this is where things start to feel off. Think about what that means in practical terms. In a neighborhood where an unfamiliar car raises eyebrows, there was a built-in category of human presence that generated zero suspicion. None. Not from the neighbors, not from the cameras, not from anyone. Take offered something, and I don't think we've gotten enough attention. He found details of a transaction on January 11th, a single purchase for Bridhan Newell's being where they say she is. You can't prove she was there. And that might just be why the FBI doesn't believe this story.
The FBI didn't go back to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood because they ran out of ideas. That's the first thing I want to address. Because when you hear that federal agents returned to an area they'd already canvassed 7 weeks into an investigation, the instinct is to read that as desperation, as an agency grasping. But that instinct is wrong, and understanding why it's wrong matters for everything that follows. Former FBI agent Steve Moore explained this through an analogy that I keep coming back to. He said, think about losing your car keys. The first place you look is where you always leave them. They're not there, so you retrace your steps. You check your pockets, the counter, the table by the door. Still nothing. You move to the second level, the couch cushions, the car itself. And eventually, when you've exhausted every place that should have had the answer, You start pulling the actual cushions off the couch and looking underneath them. Moore said that's where this investigation is now, cushion-pulling territory. What they found under one of those cushions were the construction sites. A resident in the area told Brian Anton that her friend, a neighbor with a home under construction down the street from Nancy, was contacted by FBI agents and asked to provide the names of every contractor and worker who had been on that property. Not the name of the building company, not the general contractor's business card, the individual workers, the men with the hard hats, by name. That granularity tells you something about how narrow their focus already is. They are not looking for a company, they are looking for a person. But here is the problem with stopping the analysis there. Because the construction sites aren't just a cover story angle, they are paper trails. Every residential construction project in Pima County operates under a building permit, and that permit identifies the licensed general contractor, the project address, the dates, and a required schedule of construction inspections. A building permit isn't just authorization to build, it's a calendar. Layer on top of that the material delivery logs, concrete delivery manifests, lumberyard receipts, worker schedules documented as payroll records and subcontractor invoices. All of it subpoenable, all of it date-stamped, all of it recoverable. The FBI already has the crime timeline locked. Camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m., motion detected at 2:12 a.m., pacemaker app disconnected at 2:28 a.m., 41 minutes. What they are building now is the corresponding access timeline, a complete record of every person with legitimate professional presence on those streets in the weeks before February 1st. When those two timelines are placed side by side, the investigative work becomes intersection analysis. Which names appear on the access timeline and also appear somewhere else, in a tip, in a vehicle description, in a face that recurs on a date that matters. Construction records don't close just because the concrete is cured. If you're just finding this channel, Notebook V covers the details that get overlooked, the behavior, the timeline, the thing that doesn't quite fit. Subscribe and hit the bell so you're here when the next update drops. Let's go back to January 11th, because everything in this investigation, the construction sites, the worker names, the paper trails, the access timeline, all of it keeps threading back to that one date. And the reason it keeps surfacing isn't because of a tip, it isn't because a neighbor remembered something, it isn't because Google flagged it in their metadata and handed it to investigators. It's because the FBI's own analysis produced it. Here's what most people know about the camera situation. Nancy Guthrie had a Google Nest doorbell camera at her front door. On the night of the abduction, the suspect physically removed that camera. He took it with him. The device left the property. And to any reasonable observer, that meant its evidentiary value was gone. Except he hadn't erased it. Because a networked camera isn't just a camera, it's a connected computer, a device that had been transmitting data to Google's cloud infrastructure from the moment it was installed, routing through compression servers, format processing nodes, across potentially hundreds of thousands of digital touchpoints, and at each of those stops, fragments can remain. Not necessarily as watchable video, but as data residue, bits of information embedded in layers of infrastructure that the suspect had no way of knowing existed. FBI Director Kash Patel confirmed publicly that over 8 days, investigators worked with private sector partners to recover footage from back-end systems located in back-end systems. That recovery produced the masked figure footage released to the public on February 10th. But here's what that initial coverage glossed over. The FBI didn't stop reading at February 1st. When you extract residual data from a network device's back-end infrastructure, you're reading the camera's full digital history. Every motion detection, every connection request, every signal that device sent to Google's servers across every day it was operational. Those event logs are structurally separate from the video footage. A video frame can be deleted. The record that the camera registered a motion event at a specific time, a log entry in the camera's connection history, can persist in infrastructure layers that the deletion process never reached. The FBI spent the weeks following the initial footage release going back further, reading the full digital history of that device, and that full digital history is what led them to January 11th. On March 23rd, day 51 of the investigation, Sheriff Chris Nanos gave an interview to a Tucson news station. He acknowledged that Google had retracted its suggestion about the January 11th image because the footage carried no reliable timestamp, and then he said this: "We do believe that something occurred on the 11th, and that's what the FBI's analysis of the equipment and digital stuff they've done." Read that the way a lawyer would read it. He is not saying Google told them it was January 11th. He is explicitly separating the FBI's conclusion from Google's retracted statement. Google analyzed metadata associated with the video content and said they couldn't confirm the date. The FBI analyzed the camera's operational record, the activity logs, the connection history, the hardware-level events, and said they can confirm something occurred. Those are two different tools examining two different aspects of the same evidence base, and they produced two different answers. He came back. He had been there before, and the camera he returned on February 1st specifically to remove, had already recorded his first visit in a layer of its digital infrastructure that he had no way of knowing existed. That is the operational failure that may cost him this investigation.
So now we have two visits. We have a second image, same mask, same gloves, same figure at the same address, but no backpack, no operational equipment. He is not carrying the tools of an abduction. He is present without his instruments. And every former FBI investigator and criminologist who analyzed that distinction publicly converged on the same interpretation. That visit was reconnaissance. The purpose was not to act, it was to observe, to count, to record, to verify. 21 days of advance observation before a targeted abduction. That is not casual planning. That is operational discipline. Think about what you actually need 20 days of watching to know. You need to know whether the porch light runs on a timer or motion detection. You need to know whether cars move on that street after midnight, whether any external indicator tells you when the target is asleep, whether the cameras at the address are monitored in real time or passively recorded. The Nest camera at Nancy's front door was connected to a free tier service. No live monitoring. The suspect either determined that during the January 11th visit or confirmed something he already suspected from a prior observation. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe noted publicly that the suspect's approach on the night of the abduction showed no particular furtiveness, no hesitation, the confidence of someone who had been to that location before and knew exactly what they would encounter. You do not walk toward an unfamiliar address in the dark, in a mask, in complete silence, with that degree of calm, unless you have already been there. The familiarity in the movement isn't incidental, it's the product of prior visits. The FBI's equipment analysis of the January 11th event is the forensic confirmation of what the behavioral evidence already suggested. He came back. He had been there before. But something still doesn't add up. Because if January 11th is the reconnaissance visit, the verification run, then what was the first visit? When did this actually start? The FBI confirmed something occurred on the 11th, but reconnaissance implies there was already something worth verifying, which means there was a point before January 11th when someone made a decision about Nancy Guthrie's house. That starting point, whatever it was, wherever it happened, is the part of this timeline that still hasn't fully surfaced. So how do you target someone like Nancy Guthrie? That question has been sitting at the center of this investigation since the first hours. She is not a public figure. She doesn't have a website or a professional listing or a business address that maps her to a specific street in Tucson. She is a private 84-year-old woman living quietly in a residential neighborhood. Investigators haven't been working from a single assumption about who the intended target actually was. Former FBI agent Steve Moore laid this out methodically. Did whoever planned this target Nancy herself? Did they target Savannah? Did they target Annie, Nancy's other daughter? All three remain possible. If the target was Savannah, a nationally recognized public figure, then finding a vulnerability in her family is not complicated. An elderly mother living alone in Tucson is an exposure point. The path from a decision about Savannah
to a reconnaissance visit at Nancy's house is a path that doesn't require any prior direct connection to Nancy at all. It requires research, it requires patience, and at some stage, it requires someone getting close enough to confirm the right house. And that confirmation, that final step of physical verification, is where the construction site theory intersects with the targeting question in a way that I think is genuinely underexplored. A crew working in the Catalina Foothills provides that physical access without requiring any prior direct connection to the Guthrie family. But Steve Moore took this further. He raised the question of how ambulatory Nancy actually was in the weeks before February 1st, whether she was walking through her neighborhood in January 2026. Because if she was walking any part of her neighborhood, even occasionally, even short routes near her home, then the contact question changes shape entirely. You don't need to knock on Nancy Guthrie's door to learn who she is. You might simply have seen her on a Tuesday morning in January, moving carefully along the same stretch of road she walks most Tuesdays. Someone who walks the same route creates a pattern creates predictability, and predictability to someone building an operational profile of a target is information. Moore also considered the inverse. If Nancy's health had significantly limited her movement in January, if she was not walking, not going out regularly, then the list of people who came into her physical proximity in that month becomes very short. And a short list is forensically useful. You can actually name every person who came into Nancy Guthrie's physical proximity in the month before she was taken. He raised the category of solicitors, anyone with a professional reason to approach a resident's front door, utilities workers, handymen, landscapers, anyone who might knock on a door or approach a property in the normal course of their professional day. If someone came to Nancy's door in January, even briefly, that brief interaction in the hands of someone building toward a crime is forensic yield, gathered without Nancy ever knowing it was being gathered. For most of this investigation, every significant piece of evidence arrived from somewhere else: a doorbell camera owned by Google, gloves found by volunteers on a Sunday morning, 13,000 tips called in by the public, DNA submitted to a third-party database. Every meaningful input came from outside the investigation and landed on the FBI's desk for processing. The FBI processed all of it. They worked with Google's engineers for 8 days to extract footage from a camera that had been physically removed from the property. They tested the gloves the volunteers found and traced the DNA to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the case. They showed gun shop owners across the region between 18 and 24 images and got no matches. They ran DNA through CODIS, the combined DNA index system holding genetic profiles from nearly 27 million people, and got nothing back. 13,000 tips, no named suspect. This is what investigators call a reactive posture. The investigation moves when the outside world moves it. And when the outside world stops providing useful inputs, when the tip line goes quiet, when the DNA doesn't match, a reactive investigation can do nothing except wait for the next outside input to arrive. But here is what changed. The DNA collected from Nancy Guthrie's home was a mixed sample, multiple contributors' genetic material present in the same collection. When the sample was sent to the contracted lab in Florida, the lab reported challenges. Multiple law enforcement sources described the sample to CBS News as low level, meaning there may not be sufficient material to generate a complete profile for comparison against CODIS. That's where most coverage stopped. DNA has challenges. Investigation faces setback. But that framing misses what was already happening. The FBI had already moved past the CODIS question before the public was even told about the challenges. Within 2 weeks of the initial DNA collection, genetic genealogy was already underway. They didn't wait for the CODIS question to resolve. They started both tracks simultaneously. That is not a passive response to a complication. That is a decision to keep moving regardless of what the standard database returned. So while every public-facing element of this investigation appeared to be stalling, The FBI's genetic genealogy analysts were building a family tree. They have been building it since at least the second week of February. That is 7 weeks, and in a case with this level of federal resources, 7 weeks of genetic genealogy work is not nothing.
C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs and the most prominent public expert in this field, addressed this directly when commenting on the Guthrie case. She was asked specifically whether the low-level mixed sample problem would prevent genetic genealogical analysis. Her answer was direct. You could absolutely use that same sample to create an SNP profile, single nucleotide polymorphism analysis, even if the STR profile is incomplete. SNP sequencing reads genetic data at a fundamentally higher resolution than standard CODIS testing. Where CODIS examines 20 specific genetic locations, SNP analysis examines hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genome. It can extract usable information from samples that CODIS cannot process: a partial profile, a degraded sample, a mixed contribution. The FBI has approximately 200 agents working in the genetic genealogy space. C.C. Moore's assessment that she does not expect this case to take years, that weeks to months is her professional prediction, was not optimism. It was a judgment based on the FBI's full capacity when fully deployed. Here is what 7 weeks of that work looks like in practice. In the first days, analysts generate the SNP profile from the crime scene DNA and submit it to the authorized databases, GeneMatch Pro and Family Tree DNA, the two platforms law enforcement is currently authorized to use. The system returns partial genetic matches. Those are not the answer. They are the starting point. In the following weeks, analysts build the family tree associated with those partial matches. The team uses publicly available genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, to map the tree as accurately as possible. Then comes the narrowing. Investigators apply the non-DNA evidence to the tree. The suspect is male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10" with an average build, almost certainly familiar with the Tucson area. Those filters eliminate branches. A branch composed entirely of women, eliminated. A branch based entirely in states far from Arizona, eliminated. A branch with male members of the right age and the right geographic proximity, that branch gets examined more closely. By week 7, the tree is not what it was in week 1. It is smaller, it is more focused, it contains fewer names. This is the methodology that identified Joseph James D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer. 40 years, no CODIS hit. Solved once investigative genetic genealogy was applied. Brian Koberger was arrested 47 days after the University of Idaho murders. The FBI has had 53 days in the Guthrie case. Now layer that genealogy track against the January 11th finding. If the genealogy work produces a name or narrows to a small set of candidates, investigators now have a specific date to check that name against. If that person can be placed in Tucson on January 11th, through cell tower records, through financial transactions, through the digital footprint that a person moving through a city inevitably leaves, the investigation changes shape entirely. A name produces a car produces a license plate produces a frame from someone's driveway camera that before today looked like nothing worth flagging. For the first time in 53 days, the FBI is holding 2 internally produced findings pointing in the same direction. And when those 2 findings converge on a name, the name the evidence points to, rather than a name someone volunteered, this case will have something it has never had before. Here is where we are. The FBI has the names, individual workers, individual contractors, cross-referenced against the records of active construction sites throughout the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, building permits with Pima County, delivery manifests from material suppliers, payroll records from general contractors, worker schedules documented by crew foremen and subcontractor managers. Every piece of paper that places a specific person at a specific address on a specific date in January or February of 2026. The FBI has never for 1 minute changed their theory that this was targeted.
That theory was established in the first hours of the investigation, and it has not shifted through 7 weeks of evidence review, tip analysis, DNA processing, and canvassing. The construction site inquiry represents the investigation working outward from the front door, tracing the targeting backwards in time, trying to identify where the surveillance of Nancy Guthrie began, who had the proximity and the legitimate cover story to make it possible. 7 weeks without an arrest, without a named suspect, without a confirmed location, creates pressure toward the conclusion that the investigation has stalled. But the FBI's return to the Catalina Foothills, specifically its decision to return at the level of detail represented by individual worker name requests, is not the behavior of a stalled investigation. It is the behavior of an investigation that has worked systematically through its highest priority leads and is now following the thread that remains. This is depth, not desperation. Sheriff Nanos said on March 23rd that he is not giving up, that the investigation is not cold, that they have good evidence in front of them. Savannah Guthrie posted publicly on March 21st, asking neighbors to look again at their footage and memories from January 11th, asking for the detail that in retrospect may hold significance. Nancy Guthrie has been missing 53 days. She is 84 years old. Someone planned this carefully. Someone watched this woman's house and came back to watch it again. And that person is still unidentified. The FBI is pulling up the cushions. The question is, what's underneath the one they haven't lifted yet? One thing I keep coming back to, he came back on January 11th without his equipment, which means by that point he had already been there at least once before. So when did this actually start? And how many times did he stand on that street before anyone thought to ask that question? If this case is something you want to keep following, subscribe. I will be back here with every development as it comes. And if something in this video caught your attention that I didn't cover, a detail, a timeline gap, something that felt off to you, leave it in the comments. I read all of them. The Guthrie family has been waiting 53 days. Notebook V thanks you for watching and for staying with this story. Every set of eyes on this case matters. So tell me, what is the detail in this case that you cannot stop thinking about?